Racist cop steals a black boy's gold chain, and what happens next will shock you. A young black boy is accused of theft, humiliated, and has his gold chain, a gift from his father, ripped from his neck by a racist police officer. But what followed was a fight for justice that exposed a corrupt system and changed everything. Have you ever faced a moment like this or seen someone else endure such injustice? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The small corner store on the edge of town had always been a haven for Jason Carter. The sound of the jingling bell as he entered felt like a warm welcome, and the rows of colorful snacks and drinks provided a comforting sense of familiarity. At 14, Jason was still growing into his lanky frame, his dark brown eyes bright with youthful curiosity. Around his neck hung a gold chain, a gift from his father, Daniel Carter, on his last birthday. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of love, pride, and identity. Jason ran his fingers along the shelves, pausing to inspect a pack of his favorite candy. The store was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. Yet, as Jason browsed, an unfamiliar tension began to creep into the air, like the sudden drop in temperature before a storm. Sergeant Greg Wilson leaned casually against the counter, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor anything but welcoming. His eyes locked onto Jason the moment he entered, narrowing as they trailed down to the chain glinting on the boy's chest. To Greg, it wasn't a meaningful gift, it was a target. Jason approached the counter to pay, clutching the candy in one hand and a few crumpled bills in the other. But before he could step forward, Greg shifted his weight, blocking the path. The store clerk, an older man who had seen Jason grow up, glanced nervously between them, but said nothing. "That's a nice chain you've got there," Greg said, his voice low and dripping with condescension. His hand gestured lazily toward Jason's neck. "Bet you didn't pay for it, huh?" Jason froze, confusion flashing across his face. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tightening knot in his stomach. Greg smirked, leaning closer. "You heard me. A kid like you walking around with something like that doesn't add up. Let me see it." Jason instinctively reached for the chain, his fingers curling around the gold pendant. "It's mine," he said firmly, his words edged with quiet defiance. "My dad gave it to me." Greg chuckled, the sound cold and dismissive. "Your dad, huh? Sure he did. You kids always have a story." His tone made it clear he didn't believe a word. Jason's heart pounded as he glanced around the store. The other customers, two women and a man near the back, avoided his gaze, pretending to examine items on the shelves. The store clerk shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not lying," Jason insisted, his voice rising. "This chain is mine." Greg's smirk vanished, replaced by a hard, icy glare. He took a step closer, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. "Don't raise your voice at me, boy," he snapped. "Hand it over before I take it myself." Jason's hands trembled as he clutched the chain tighter. He wanted to yell, to fight, to tell this man he had no right, but fear held him in place. He had heard the stories, seen the news. Boys like him didn't win confrontations like this. Greg reached out suddenly, his fingers closing around the chain. With a sharp yank, he tore it from Jason's neck. The sound of the clasp snapping was deafening in the otherwise silent store. Jason gasped, his hand flying to the empty space where the chain had hung. His chest burned with a mix of humiliation and anger as Greg held the chain up, inspecting it like a trophy. "Thought so," Greg said, pocketing the chain with a careless shrug. "You don't look like someone who can afford this." Tears pricked the corners of Jason's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His fists clenched at his sides as he fought to keep his composure. He looked around the store again, hoping, begging for someone to speak up, but the customers remained silent. The store clerk avoided his gaze, his hands busy rearranging items that didn't need rearranging. Greg turned to leave, the chain jingling in his pocket. "Next time," he said over his shoulder, "don't walk around acting like you're something you're not." The words hit Jason harder than the loss of the chain. They stripped away not just his dignity, but a part of who he was. For a moment, he stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing with anger, shame, and helplessness. And then, just as Greg reached the door, the bell above it jingled again. A tall figure stepped inside, his presence commanding and calm. Jason's breath caught as he recognized his father, Daniel Carter. Daniel's sharp eyes quickly took in the scene, the flush on Jason's cheeks, the tension in his posture, and the smug expression on Greg's face. His voice, low and steady, cut through the silence like a knife. "What's going on here?" Greg paused, momentarily taken aback. "Just doing my job," he said, his tone defensive. "This kid was wearing stolen property. I confiscated it." Daniel stepped closer, his gaze locked onto Greg's. "That chain isn't stolen," he said evenly. "It's a gift. From me." Greg's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Look, I don't know who you think you are. You don't need to know who I am," Daniel interrupted, his voice like steel. "You need to know that you just robbed my son." The tension in the store was palpable as the two men faced off. Jason watched his father, a flicker of hope sparking beneath the storm of emotions swirling inside him. For the first time since the encounter began, he didn't feel entirely alone. The air in the corner store thickened as Daniel Carter stepped closer to Greg Wilson, the room falling into a tense silence. Every detail of the scene was etched into Daniel's mind. His son's clenched fists, the flush of anger on his cheeks, and the slight tremor in his voice. He knew Jason was holding back tears, and Daniel's jaw tightened. "Return the chain," Daniel said, his tone measured but carrying an edge that demanded attention. Greg's smug expression didn't waver, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He took a deliberate step back, his hand resting on his belt where his holstered weapon sat. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Greg replied, his voice dripping with mock authority. "This chain is evidence of theft, and I'm taking it in for processing." Daniel didn't blink. His gaze remained locked on Greg, unwavering and steady. "Evidence?" he repeated, his voice calm but sharper now. "You saw a boy wearing a gold chain, made a baseless assumption, and ripped it off his neck. That's not evidence. That's robbery." Greg's hand shifted on his belt, his fingers grazing the edge of his holster. It was a subtle movement, but its implication was clear. A faint murmur rippled through the store as one of the customers shifted uncomfortably, and the store clerk's eyes darted toward the security cameras overhead. "Careful," Greg said, his voice lowering into something resembling a threat. "You don't want to escalate this." Daniel took another step forward, closing the gap between them. His voice didn't rise, but the power in his words was undeniable. "The only one escalating anything here is you. Let me make myself clear. You're not taking another step with that chain in your pocket." Jason stood frozen a few feet away, watching the exchange with wide eyes. He had seen his father command a room before. His presence as a federal agent always carried weight, but this was different. This wasn't just a professional interaction. This was personal. Greg straightened, puffing out his chest. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he demanded, his arrogance flaring as he leaned closer to Daniel. "I've been on this force for over a decade. I know what I'm doing." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate precision, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather badge wallet. He flipped it open, revealing his credentials as an FBI agent. "Do you know who you're talking to?" Daniel replied, his voice like steel. The shift in the room was immediate. The customers who had been pretending not to watch now openly stared. Greg's smirk wavered, replaced by a fleeting moment of panic that he quickly tried to mask. "This doesn't concern the feds," Greg said, attempting to sound dismissive. "It's a local matter. You've got no jurisdiction here." "I have jurisdiction wherever the law is being broken," Daniel said, taking a step closer. "And what I see here is an officer abusing his authority to humiliate and rob a child." Greg's bravado cracked further, but he dug in his heels. "I was doing my job," he insisted. "This kid was wearing something that didn't belong to him. I confiscated it. End of story." "No," Daniel replied, his tone growing colder. "The end of the story is you handing back what you stole." Right now, the standoff hung in the air, each man refusing to back down. Jason felt the tension in his chest, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might echo in the room. From the corner of his eye, Jason noticed one of the customers, a woman with her phone angled subtly upward, recording the scene. The realization sent a flicker of hope through him. Maybe, just maybe, someone would care enough to make sure this moment wasn't forgotten. Greg's hand dropped from his belt, though his expression remained defiant. "Look, I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I saw something suspicious, and I acted on it. That's my job." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Your job is to protect and serve, not profile a kid in a corner store, not tear a chain off his neck because of your own biases." He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that still carried through the room. "And not make the mistake of thinking that badge makes you untouchable." Greg's face flushed, and for the first time, his confidence seemed to falter completely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the chain, holding it loosely in his hand. He hesitated, glancing around the room as if searching for an ally, but no one moved. "Fine," he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. He held out the chain, and Jason stepped forward hesitantly, taking it with trembling fingers. The weight of the chain in Jason's hand felt heavier than it had before. It was no longer just a gift. It was a reminder of what had been stripped from him and what his father had fought to restore. Daniel nodded once at Jason, then turned his attention back to Greg. "Let me make this clear," he said. "What you did today won't go unnoticed. There will be consequences for this." Greg opened his mouth as if to argue, but Daniel cut him off with a sharp look. "Walk away, Wilson, while you still can." The store remained silent as Greg took a step back, his shoulders tense and his jaw clenched. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, the bell jingling faintly in his wake. As the tension in the room eased, the customers slowly returned to their browsing, though many continued to cast glances at Daniel and Jason. The store clerk finally broke his silence, clearing his throat awkwardly. "If there's anything I can do," he began, but Daniel shook his head. "We're fine," he said curtly. He turned to Jason, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let's go," he said softly. Jason followed his father out of the store, clutching the chain tightly in his hand. The cold night air hit his face as they stepped outside, but it did little to cool the heat of emotion swirling within him. As they walked toward the car, Daniel glanced down at his son. "This isn't the end of it," he said quietly, his voice firm. "What happened back there is part of something bigger, and I'm going to make sure it stops." Jason looked up at his father, the flicker of hope from earlier growing just a little stronger. For the first time since the chain had been ripped from his neck, he felt a spark of pride. The drive home from the corner store was oppressively quiet. Jason sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the faint glow of streetlights danced across his face. He clenched the gold chain tightly in his hand, its weight now carrying more than just sentimental value. His chest ached with a whirlwind of emotions: humiliation, anger, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. Beside him, Daniel gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He stole glances at his son, his heart heavy with guilt. Daniel could feel the tension radiating from Jason, but he knew better than to press him. Not yet. When they pulled into the driveway, Jason was out of the car before the engine fully stopped, the slam of the door reverberating through the cool night air. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before stepping out and following him inside. Vanessa Carter was waiting in the living room, her expression softening with relief when she saw them. But the moment she caught sight of Jason's hunched shoulders and the stormy look in his eyes, concern replaced her relief. "Jason, what happened?" she asked gently, stepping toward him. Jason didn't answer. He brushed past her, heading straight for his room and slamming the door shut behind him. "Daniel?" Vanessa turned to her husband, her voice tinged with worry. Daniel hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Greg Wilson," he said simply, the name heavy with disdain. Vanessa's eyes widened. "The officer from the corner store? What did he do?" Daniel gave her a brief rundown of the encounter, his voice calm but edged with simmering anger. As he spoke, Vanessa's expression darkened. "That man shouldn't even have a badge," she said firmly. "How could he—" "I know," Daniel interrupted, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm going to handle it." Vanessa nodded but didn't look reassured. She glanced toward Jason's closed door. "And Jason? He's angry," Daniel admitted, "and he has every right to be." Vanessa sighed, her gaze softening. "I'll talk to him." Inside his room, Jason paced restlessly, the chain still clutched in his hand. His mind raced, replaying the confrontation over and over like a broken record. Every word Greg had said echoed in his ears, cutting deeper each time. "You don't look like someone who can afford this." Jason squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head as if he could force the memory away, but it was no use. He could still feel the humiliation, the judgment in Greg's eyes, and the sting of being powerless to stop it. He sank onto his bed, the chain slipping through his fingers as he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. His thoughts drifted to school, to the bullies who used to taunt him for being different. He remembered the cruel laughter, the whispered jokes about how he didn't belong, and the way he used to pretend their words didn't hurt. It was the same feeling now, the same sense of being small, exposed and judged for something he couldn't control. A soft knock at the door broke through his thoughts. "Jason!" Vanessa's voice was calm, but he could hear the worry beneath it. "Go away," he muttered. The door creaked open anyway, and Vanessa stepped inside. She sat down on the edge of his bed, giving him space but not leaving. "You don't have to talk," she said gently, "but I'm here if you want to." Jason stayed silent for a long moment, staring at the floor. Finally he spoke, his voice low and trembling. "Why does this keep happening? Why can't they just leave us alone?" Vanessa's heart broke at the raw pain in his voice. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, baby," she said softly. "I wish I could give you an answer, but some people, they let their own hate and fear blind them. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it doesn't change who you are." Jason swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "It's like no matter what I do, they just see me as a problem. Like I don't belong." "You do belong," Vanessa said firmly, her voice steady. "And nothing they say or do can change that." Jason's hand tightened around the chain, his knuckles whitening. "Dad just stood there and let him take it," he said bitterly. "He only did something when it was already too late." Vanessa's heart ached for him, but she knew he was wrong about his father. "Your dad didn't let him take it," she said. "He fought for you. He stood up to him and made sure you got it back." Jason shook his head, his voice rising with frustration. "But it shouldn't have happened at all. If he's so strong, why didn't he stop it sooner?" The anger in his voice was a knife in Vanessa's chest, but she remained calm. "Jason," she said quietly, "your dad has spent his whole life fighting people like Greg Wilson. He's seen this kind of injustice over and over, and I know it hurts him just as much as it hurts you, but he can't be everywhere, and he can't stop every bad thing from happening. What he can do is fight to make it right when it does." Jason didn't respond, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. Vanessa leaned in, wrapping her arms around him. "You're not alone in this, Jason," she said. "We're in this together." Later that night, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The memory of Jason's anger still weighed on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd failed as a father. He thought back to his own childhood, to the times he'd been singled out, humiliated, and told he didn't belong. He had promised himself back then that he would protect his future family from those same injustices. But now, it felt like history was repeating itself, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shield Jason from the world's cruelty. Vanessa entered the room, her footsteps light. She placed a mug of tea in front of Daniel and sat across from him. "He's scared," she said softly, "and he's hurting. But he knows you're on his side." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "It's not enough," he said. "I should have done more. I should have stopped it before it even started." "You did what you could," Vanessa said, her voice steady. "And now you're doing more. But you have to be careful, Daniel. This fight isn't just about Greg Wilson. It's about an entire system, and systems like that don't go down without a fight." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, "but I can't let this go. Not after what happened to Jason." Vanessa reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she said. "This family can't afford to lose you." Daniel squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. "I promise," he said. As the night stretched on, Jason lay in bed, staring at the chain resting on his nightstand. The anger in his chest hadn't completely faded, but it had been replaced by a flicker of something else. A quiet determination. In the kitchen, Daniel stared out the window, his jaw tight. This wasn't just about one bad officer or one bad encounter. It was about a system that allowed men like Greg Wilson to thrive, and Daniel was ready to take it on. The light from Daniel's desk lamp cast long shadows across the room as he leaned back in his chair, poring over files on his laptop. His office, usually a place of order, was now cluttered with printouts, sticky notes, and his handwritten notes on Greg Wilson. A growing stack of papers on the corner of his desk detailed years of complaints and allegations against Greg. Racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct that had been swept under the rug by his department. Daniel's brow furrowed as he clicked through more records. Each file painted the same picture. Greg's abuses were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that had been ignored by the system meant to hold him accountable. One complaint in particular caught Daniel's eye. A young black man had accused Greg of stopping him without cause, physically intimidating him, and then falsifying the report to justify the encounter. The case had been dismissed, marked with a single word: unsubstantiated. Daniel rubbed his temples, frustration gnawing at him. He knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. The door creaked open, and Vanessa stepped inside, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. She placed it on the desk, without a word, and sat down across from him. Her presence was grounding, but Daniel could see the concern etched on her face. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Worse than I thought," Daniel admitted, gesturing to the files. "It's not just Greg. It's the whole system. The complaints were ignored, buried, or dismissed outright, And he's been doing this for years. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, and his department let him get away with it. Daniel nodded. Either they looked the other way or they actively protected him. This isn't negligence, it's complicity. Vanessa reached across the desk, her hand brushing his. You're taking on more than just one man, Daniel? You know that, right? I do, he said, his voice firm. But I can't let this go. Meanwhile, at school, Jason felt like the walls were closing in on him. The video of the incident at the corner store had gone viral, and whispers followed him wherever he went. In the hallways, classmates turned to stare at him before quickly looking away, as if being caught watching would somehow involve them. Some of his peers approached him awkwardly, offering words of support that often felt more like pity. Hey man, I saw the video. That was messed up, one boy had said earlier that day. Jason had nodded mutely, not knowing how to respond. Others weren't as kind. A group of students at lunch whispered loudly enough for Jason to hear, mocking the situation and speculating that he had probably deserved it. Why would a kid like him even have a gold chain? One of them sneered. Jason clenched his fists under the table, his appetite vanishing. After school, Jason headed to soccer practice, his shoulders weighed down with the day's events. The field, usually a place where he felt free, now felt like another stage where people were watching him too closely. He fumbled a pass during a scrimmage, and the sting of his teammates' frustration only added to his mounting sense of isolation. As the team dispersed, Jason lingered on the bleachers, staring at the empty field. He pulled out a small notebook from his bag, something he had started carrying recently. At first, he had used it to jot down random thoughts, but now it was becoming a place to unload the emotions he couldn't voice aloud. He flipped to a fresh page and began writing. I hate that they look at me like I'm different. I hate that they talk about me like I'm not even there. But most of all, I hate that I don't know how to make it stop. Jason's grip on the pen tightened as he scrawled the words. The act of writing didn't fix anything, but it gave him a small sense of control. Carter. Jason looked up to see Coach Harris approaching, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Jason quickly shut the notebook and shoved it into his bag. You've been off your game lately, Coach Harris said, sitting down beside him. His tone was stern, but there was an undercurrent of concern. I'm fine, Jason muttered, avoiding his gaze. Don't give me that, Harris said, shaking his head. I've been coaching you for 3 years, Jason. I know when something's eating at you. Jason hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the zipper of his bag. Finally, he said, It's just stuff. Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'm not going to push you, but whatever this stuff is, don't let it take you down. You've got talent, Carter. Don't let anything or anyone make you forget that. Jason glanced at him, the faintest flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Thanks, Coach. Anytime, Harris said, clapping him on the shoulder before walking away. Back at the FBI office, Daniel met with his supervisor, Linda Grace. A sharp, no-nonsense woman with years of experience, Linda had always been someone Daniel trusted. But as he laid out the evidence against Greg, he noticed the subtle shift in her expression. A flicker of hesitation. This is solid, Linda said, flipping through the files. But Daniel, you're walking a fine line here. What do you mean? Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. Linda leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes fixed on him. You're personally connected to this case. That's not a problem for me, but others are going to see it as a conflict of interest. They'll say you're too close to be objective. I'm not backing down, Daniel said firmly. I didn't say you should, Linda replied. I just want you to be prepared. The deeper you dig, the more resistance you're going to face. And if you misstep, they'll use it to bury you. And the case. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. I'll be careful. But this needs to be done, Linda sighed, closing the file. All right, I'll back you. But we need to do this by the book. No shortcuts. Understood, Daniel said. As he left Linda's office, Daniel felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He knew she was right. The risks were enormous. But the image of Jason's face that night at the corner store kept replaying in his mind, fueling his resolve. That evening, as Daniel worked late into the night, Jason sat at his desk, staring at the words he had written in his notebook earlier. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, putting his thoughts on paper could help him make sense of everything. Meanwhile, Daniel sifted through yet another stack of files, uncovering more troubling patterns within Greg's department. It was becoming increasingly clear that Greg wasn't the only one guilty. He was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The deeper Daniel Carter dug into Greg Wilson's history, the clearer the web of corruption became. Late into the night, Daniel sat at his desk, a grim expression etched across his face as he sifted through yet another stack of reports. The pattern was undeniable. Greg's actions were not isolated incidents, nor were they the reckless exploits of a rogue officer. They were symptomatic of a system designed to protect itself, no matter the cost. Each complaint against Greg had been neatly filed away, stamped with words like unsubstantiated or lack of evidence. Witness statements were missing, and body cam footage had either been misplaced or conveniently corrupted. What troubled Daniel most was how many of these cases had been quietly closed by higher-ranking officials. One particular case caught his attention. A woman named Teresa Alvarez had filed a report 3 years ago, accusing Greg of planting drugs during a routine traffic stop. Her account was detailed and consistent, but the case had been dismissed within a week. As Daniel read further, he discovered that the officer responsible for reviewing the complaint, Lieutenant Carl Matheson, had a long history of dismissing similar allegations. "Follow the trail," Daniel muttered to himself, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched for more connections. Across town, Greg Wilson was unraveling. The whispers of an FBI investigation had reached the precinct, and though no one had confronted him directly, Greg could feel the weight of suspicion in every sideways glance and hushed conversation. His once confident stride had turned cautious, his nerves fraying with each passing day. At first, Greg had dismissed the rumors as nothing more than idle chatter, but as the days stretched on, he couldn't ignore the signs. Officers who once stood by him now avoided his gaze. His commanding officer, usually friendly, had become distant and curt. Greg's paranoia began to bleed into his work. During a routine traffic stop, he snapped at a fellow officer for questioning his authority, causing an uncomfortable scene. At the precinct, he lashed out at a younger colleague who accidentally spilled coffee near his desk, accusing him of sabotage. In private moments, Greg pored over his own records, deleting emails and shredding documents he thought might incriminate him. But no matter how much he tried to cover his tracks, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The Carters' home, usually a sanctuary, had also become a target. Late one evening, as Vanessa Carter was locking up the house, she noticed an envelope wedged into the frame of the front door. There was no return address, no markings, just her family's last name scrawled across the front in thick, uneven letters. Her heart sank as she carefully opened it, revealing a single piece of paper inside. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Vanessa stood frozen in the doorway, the note trembling in her hand. A chill ran down her spine as she looked out into the dark street, half expecting to see someone watching. She quickly shut the door and locked it, her pulse racing. When Daniel came home that night, she showed him the note. His expression darkened as he read it, his grip on the paper tightening. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his voice low but steady. "It's working," Vanessa admitted, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Daniel, this isn't just about you anymore. They're coming after our family." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle it," he said firmly. "You can't handle this alone," Vanessa shot back. "This isn't just some bad cop. You're going up against a whole system that will do whatever it takes to protect itself." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "I know, but I'm not stopping." The next morning, Daniel received an anonymous tip through a secure email account he had set up for whistleblowers. The message was brief and to the point. "I have information about Greg Wilson and the precinct. Meet me in person. No phones, no cameras." The message included an address, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Later that afternoon, Daniel arrived at the cafe, scanning the room for anyone who might match the description of his mysterious contact. He spotted a man sitting in a corner booth, his cap pulled low and his jacket zipped up despite the warm weather. As Daniel approached, the man looked up, his face tense with fear. "Are you Carter?" he asked in a hushed voice. Daniel nodded. "And you are?" The man hesitated, glancing around the room before leaning closer. "Just call me Alex. I work at the precinct." All right, Alex, Daniel said, keeping his voice calm and steady. What do you have for me? Alex slid a small flash drive across the table. Everything you need, he said. Emails, internal memos, body cam footage that was supposed to be deleted. It's all there. Daniel picked up the drive, slipping it into his pocket. Why come forward now? He asked. Alex looked down at his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. Because I've seen what Wilson's done, what they've all done, and I can't stay silent anymore. But you have to promise me something. He looked up, his eyes pleading. You can't let them know it was me. If they find out, they won't, Daniel assured him. I'll protect you. Alex nodded, though his expression remained wary. Be careful, Carter. You're walking into something big. Back at his office, Daniel plugged the flash drive into his computer. The files it contained were damning. Internal emails revealed how complaints against Greg had been deliberately buried, with high-ranking officers instructing subordinates to handle it quietly. One particularly incriminating memo detailed a conversation between Greg and Lieutenant Matheson, in which Matheson had explicitly advised Greg to stay off the radar following a high-profile misconduct case. The body cam footage was worse. One clip showed Greg harassing a group of teenagers in a park, demanding to search their bags without cause. Another clip captured him berating a man during a traffic stop, his tone dripping with contempt. Daniel forwarded the files to Linda Grace, including a summary of the key findings. That evening, she called him, her voice a mix of shock and concern. This is explosive, Linda said. If we move forward with this, it's not just Greg we're going after. It's the entire chain of command. You need to understand the risks. I do, Daniel said. And I'm ready. Linda sighed. All right, let's make it airtight. No room for them to wiggle out of this. The tension at the Carter household continued to simmer. Daniel shared some of the details with Vanessa, but he kept the worst of it to himself, not wanting to worry her further. Jason, meanwhile, noticed the increased security measures his father had quietly implemented, checking the locks twice, adding cameras to the front door. One evening, Jason approached Daniel in his office. Are you scared? He asked, his voice hesitant. Daniel looked up from his computer, surprised by the question. Sometimes, he admitted. But I'm more scared of what happens if I don't do anything. Jason nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. He didn't say anything else, but Daniel could sense the wheels turning in his son's mind. With the evidence in hand and a whistleblower's testimony adding credibility, Daniel knew it was time to confront Greg directly. But as he prepared to expose the corruption, he also knew the stakes had never been higher. For his family, for the community, and for the system itself. The precinct buzzed with its usual mix of chaos and routine, a constant hum of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and murmured conversations. But when Daniel Carter walked through the front doors alongside Linda Grace, the energy shifted. Heads turned, conversations quieted, and officers exchanged wary glances. Daniel's calm but focused demeanor cut through the noise like a blade. Clad in his tailored FBI jacket, his presence commanded attention. Linda, walking beside him, carried a thick folder of evidence, her expression unreadable but purposeful. Greg Wilson stood at the far end of the room, leaning casually against a desk, chatting with a few colleagues. When he spotted Daniel and Linda, his smirk faltered for a split second before he quickly masked it with a look of feigned disinterest. Wilson, Linda called out, her voice sharp and authoritative. Greg straightened up, his smirk returning. Agent Grace, he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. To what do I owe the pleasure? Linda didn't answer right away. Instead, she gestured toward one of the nearby interrogation rooms. Let's talk. Now. Greg hesitated, his eyes flickering toward his colleagues as if seeking reassurance. Finally, he shrugged and followed them. His swagger intact, but his movements tense. Inside the room, the air was thick with tension. Greg leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk firmly in place. Linda and Daniel sat across from him, their expressions cool and professional. On the table between them sat the folder, thick with documents, printouts, and photographs. So, Greg began, his tone smug. What's this about? Another fishing expedition? Daniel didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a still frame from one of the recovered body cam videos, showing Greg towering over a young man with his hand clenched tightly around the man's collar. "Let's start here," Daniel said, his voice calm but laced with steel. Greg's smirk faltered as he glanced at the photo. That's nothing. Routine stop. That kid was resisting." "Was he?" Linda interjected, pulling out a transcript of the audio from the video. She read aloud. "I haven't done anything wrong. Please let me go." "That doesn't sound like resistance, Sergeant Wilson." Greg shrugged, leaning back. "You don't know the full story. People like him." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "People like him?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. Greg hesitated but quickly recovered. "You're twisting my words," he said. "This is ridiculous." Daniel slid another document across the table, an email exchange between Greg and Lieutenant Matheson, discussing how to handle complaints. "This isn't ridiculous, Wilson. This is a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. And we're not just looking at you, we're looking at everyone who covered for you." Greg's bravado wavered, but he forced a laugh. "You're reaching, Carter. This is nothing but a smear campaign." Linda leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "We have body cam footage, victim testimonies, and internal memos. It's not a smear campaign, it's evidence. And it's enough to bring charges." For the first time, Greg's confidence visibly cracked. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, and his jaw tightened. But then, in a desperate move, he leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing at Daniel. "You think you're so high and mighty," Greg hissed. "You think your badge makes you better than me. Newsflash, Carter. You're just like the rest of us, and you're going to regret coming after me." Daniel didn't flinch. He met Greg's gaze with an unyielding calm, his voice steady. "The difference between us, Wilson, is that I don't abuse the trust that comes with my badge. You do. And now you're going to answer for it." The door to the interrogation room burst open as Lieutenant Matheson stormed in, his face flushed with anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, glaring at Linda and Daniel. Linda didn't miss a beat. "We're in the middle of a federal investigation," she said coolly. "And if you're here to interfere, I'd suggest you think twice." "This is my precinct," Matheson shot back. "You can't just come in here and—" Daniel stood, cutting him off. "We have evidence implicating you, Lieutenant. You've spent years burying complaints and protecting Wilson. So unless you want to be the next one in cuffs, I suggest you sit down and cooperate." Matheson froze, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. The tension in the room was palpable. Outside the interrogation room, the precinct had become a hive of barely contained chaos. Officers whispered among themselves, and the mood was tense. Some officers exchanged looks of unease, while others murmured their support for Greg. As word spread that the FBI was confronting Greg and Matheson, the precinct began to fracture. Heated arguments broke out between officers, some defending Greg and others calling for accountability. "You know he's crossed the line before," one officer said. "And you haven't?" Another shot back. The atmosphere grew so volatile that the captain had to step in, ordering everyone to return to their posts. But the damage was done. The precinct was no longer united. Inside the interrogation room, the walls were closing in on Greg. Linda handed him a final document, her voice cold. "This is a warrant for your arrest, Sergeant Wilson. You're being charged with misconduct, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice." Greg's face turned red with fury. He shot to his feet, slamming his hands on the table. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You're out to get me because I did my job." Daniel stood as well, his gaze unwavering. "Your job isn't to harass and intimidate people, Wilson. It's to protect them. And you failed." For a moment, it seemed like Greg might lunge at Daniel. His fists clenched, his face twisted with rage. But before he could act, two officers entered the room and restrained him. "Get your hands off me!" Greg bellowed, struggling against their grip. "Enough!" Linda snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Take him into custody." As Greg was led out of the room in handcuffs, the precinct fell silent. Officers watched as one of their own was escorted away, their expressions a mix of shock, anger, and unease. Daniel stepped out into the main room, his expression unreadable. He felt the weight of every eye on him, but he didn't falter. Greg's arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the precinct, igniting a firestorm of public outrage. The morning after Greg Wilson's arrest, the Carter household was anything but quiet. News outlets had caught wind of the story, and by sunrise, their names were plastered across social media and television. Headlines ranged from FBI agent exposes corruption in local police department to, "Is this the beginning of the end for law enforcement abuse?" Jason sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with a tight knot in his stomach. His face, captured in the viral video of the confrontation at the corner store, stared back at him from countless posts. Some users called him brave, praising his family for standing up to injustice. Others, however, weren't so kind. "Look at this," Jason muttered, sliding his phone toward his mom, Vanessa, who was sitting across from him. Vanessa picked up the phone and frowned as she read the comments. "Another kid playing the victim card. Bet he started the whole thing. His dad's just trying to get attention. The whole family's probably in on it." She set the phone down with a sigh, placing a hand over Jason's. "Don't let them get to you," she said gently. "It's hard not to," Jason replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like no matter what I do, people are going to twist it into something else." The front door slammed open, and Daniel walked in, a pile of newspapers tucked under his arm. His face was a mixture of determination and weariness. "We're everywhere," he said, tossing the papers onto the table. The headlines were bold and attention-grabbing. FBI agent takes down dirty cop, small-town scandal unveiled, and hero or troublemaker, the debate over Daniel Carter. Vanessa glanced at the papers, her frown deepening. "Hero or troublemaker?" she read aloud. "They're really trying to spin this both ways." "Of course they are," Daniel said, sitting down and pouring himself a cup of coffee. "The media loves a controversy." Jason pushed his chair back abruptly, standing up. "So now we're just some story for people to argue about?" he said, his voice rising. "It's not even about what actually happened anymore." "Jason," Daniel began, his tone calm but firm. "No, Dad," Jason snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Do you know what it's like to walk into school and have people either pity you or hate you? To see them whispering like you're some kind of freak?" Vanessa stood, placing a hand on Jason's shoulder. "Jason, calm down," she said softly. Jason shook his head. "How am I supposed to calm down when everyone's talking about me like I don't even exist?" At school, Jason's day didn't get any easier. As he walked through the hallways, he felt the weight of countless eyes on him. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Some students not even bothering to lower their voices. "I heard his dad got that cop fired," one girl said. "Yeah, well, his dad's FBI. Of course they're going to protect their own," another boy replied. Jason clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he tried to block out their voices. In history class, the tension finally boiled over. Jason was taking notes when a boy sitting behind him leaned forward. "So, is it true?" the boy asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Jason turned, confused. "What are you talking about? Did your dad fake all that evidence just to make that cop look bad?" the boy said, smirking. The room fell silent. All eyes were on Jason, waiting for his response. Jason felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaking. "Sure I do," the boy shot back. "I saw the news. People are saying your dad's just trying to make himself look good. Maybe you made the whole thing up." Jason stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice, usually soft and measured, rose with uncharacteristic intensity. "You think I wanted any of this?" he snapped. "You think I made it up when that cop humiliated me in front of everyone? When he ripped the chain off my neck like I was nothing?" The boy opened his mouth to reply but faltered under the weight of Jason's glare. Jason took a deep breath, his voice steadier now. "If you want to believe some made-up story, fine. But don't you dare tell me what happened to me." The teacher finally stepped in, urging Jason to sit down. The class resumed, but the atmosphere remained tense. Jason, however, felt a small spark of relief. For the first time, he had spoken up for himself, refusing to let someone else control his narrative. That evening, Jason sat in his room, the confrontation replaying in his mind. He opened his notebook and began writing, the words flowing faster than they ever had before. "Today, I realized something. People will believe what they want, no matter how much truth you show them. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting. You fight because your story matters, even if they don't want to hear it. As he wrote, a small weight lifted off his chest. The notebook was no longer just a place to unload his pain. It was becoming a way for him to find his voice. At home, Daniel was dealing with his own wave of backlash. While some praised him for exposing Greg Wilson and standing up against corruption, others accused him of tearing apart the system and putting officers in danger. During a video call with Linda Grace, Daniel discussed the growing resistance. "Some of the higher-ups aren't happy," Linda said, her tone cautious. "They're accusing you of making the department look bad." "They made themselves look bad," Daniel replied. "All I did was shine a light on it." "You're not wrong," Linda said. "But you need to be careful. The more noise you make, the more enemies you'll attract." Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had expected resistance, but the personal attacks against him and his family were starting to take their toll. Vanessa entered the room, her arms crossed. "They're not just coming after you, Daniel," she said. "Jason's feeling it too, and so am I." Daniel looked up, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I know," he said, "and I hate that you're caught in the middle of this. But if we don't fight back, who will?" Vanessa sighed, sitting beside him. "I just don't want this fight to tear us apart." "It won't," Daniel said firmly. "We'll get through this. Together." The momentum of Daniel Carter's investigation was undeniable, but with every step forward came mounting resistance. The evidence Daniel and Linda had unearthed implicated not just Greg Wilson, but several high-ranking officials in the local police department. These were individuals who had dismissed complaints, altered reports, and actively protected Greg's pattern of misconduct. The more names Daniel uncovered, the more dangerous his fight became. These weren't just corrupt officers. They were part of a network that had everything to lose if exposed. One morning, as Daniel reviewed case files in his office, his phone buzzed with a notification. A news article had just been published, its headline glaring across the screen. "FBI Agent Carter's bias. Is the investigation personal?" Daniel's jaw tightened as he opened the article. It accused him of using the investigation as a personal vendetta against Greg Wilson, citing his son Jason's involvement as evidence. The article claimed Daniel was too emotionally compromised to lead an impartial case, a narrative clearly planted by those he was investigating. His phone buzzed again, this time a text from Linda Grace. "Linda, have you seen it?" Daniel, "I have. They're scared." Linda, "Scared and desperate. But this is just the beginning. Be careful." The smear campaign escalated quickly. Anonymous sources fed stories to the press, framing Daniel as overzealous and vengeful. At the FBI office, he felt the subtle shift in how some of his colleagues treated him. Conversations grew shorter, their tone more guarded. One agent, a younger man named Eric, stopped him in the hallway. "Daniel," he said hesitantly, "I don't want to overstep, but some people are saying you should let this one go. You know, before it gets messy." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "It's already messy, Eric. And if we stop now, it stays that way." Eric nodded, his expression uneasy. "Just watch your back." That warning became all too real a few nights later. Daniel was driving home after a late meeting with Linda. The streets were quiet, the hum of his car the only sound as he navigated the winding road leading to his neighborhood. Suddenly, the steering wheel jerked violently to the right. Daniel's heart pounded as he fought to regain control, but the car swerved, skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car finally came to a halt. Breathing heavily, he stepped out to inspect the damage. The front left tire was flat, but it wasn't a normal puncture. Someone had deliberately tampered with the lug nuts, loosening them enough to create a hazard. Daniel's blood ran cold. This wasn't a warning, it was a message. When he got home, Vanessa was waiting for him. She immediately noticed his pale face and shaken demeanor. "What happened?" she demanded. Daniel hesitated before explaining, his voice calm but laced with tension. As he spoke, Vanessa's expression shifted from worry to anger. "This is what I was afraid of," she said, her voice trembling. "They're not just trying to scare you. They're trying to hurt you. What if Jason had been in the car with you? What if—" "Vanessa," Daniel interrupted gently, placing his hands on her shoulders. I'm fine. And I'm not backing down. Her eyes filled with tears of frustration. You say that like it's just about you, Daniel. But it's not. It's about us. About Jason. How much more are you willing to risk? Daniel exhaled slowly, his resolve unwavering. As much as it takes, he said quietly. Meanwhile, Jason found himself thrust into a different kind of battle. A community meeting had been called to address the fallout from Greg's arrest and the broader implications of Daniel's investigation. Jason attended reluctantly, sitting quietly near the back of the crowded room. He recognized many of the faces, neighbors, teachers, local business owners, but the atmosphere was far from welcoming. The meeting began with impassioned speeches from community leaders calling for accountability and reform. But as the discussion opened to the floor, tensions erupted. A man in his 50s stood, his face flushed with anger. "This investigation is tearing our town apart," he shouted. "We have good officers being dragged through the mud because of one bad apple." A woman on the other side of the room shot to her feet. "One bad apple?" she retorted. "This isn't just about Wilson. This is about a system that let him get away with it for years." The room descended into chaos as voices overlapped, each side growing louder. Jason watched, his stomach twisting as the divide in the community became painfully clear. Suddenly, someone turned to Jason. "You're Carter's kid, right?" Jason froze, the eyes of the room now on him. "What do you think, huh?" the man continued, his tone accusatory. "Your dad's out there ruining lives. What's he really trying to prove?" Jason's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stand. His voice, though quiet, cut through the noise. "He's trying to make sure people like Greg Wilson don't ruin more lives," he said. "Including mine." The room fell silent for a moment before erupting again. But Jason sat down, his hands trembling. He had spoken his truth, even if it felt like a drop in an ocean of chaos. Later that night, Jason recounted the meeting to his parents. Daniel listened intently, his expression somber. "I didn't know what else to say," Jason admitted. I didn't want them to think we were doing this for the wrong reasons." "You said exactly what needed to be said," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "Sometimes that's all you can do. Stand up and tell the truth." Vanessa, sitting beside Jason, nodded. "And that's more than most people are willing to do." Despite the pushback, Daniel pressed on, his focus now shifting to the upcoming trial. The evidence was strong, but he knew the other side would fight tooth and nail to protect themselves. In the days leading up to the trial, the pressure mounted. The smear campaign intensified. Anonymous threats became more frequent, and the tension in the Carter household reached a breaking point. With the trial looming, Daniel knew the battle ahead would be the defining moment of their fight. It wasn't just about Greg Wilson anymore. It was about exposing the rot within the system and proving that justice, though difficult, was worth the risk. The courthouse was packed on the first day of Greg Wilson's trial. Rows of spectators, reporters, and community members filled the gallery, their expressions ranging from anticipation to quiet apprehension. The tension in the air was almost tangible, a shared understanding that the trial was about more than one man. It was about a system on trial for its complicity. Daniel Carter sat at the prosecution's table, his expression calm but focused. Beside him, the lead attorney, Maria Hernandez, shuffled through a thick stack of papers, her movements deliberate and precise. Across the room, Greg Wilson sat stiffly at the defense table, his jaw clenched and his eyes scanning the room. Greg's attorney, Grant Holloway, a sharp-tongued and seasoned defense lawyer, exuded confidence as he leaned back in his chair, appearing unbothered by the crowd's scrutiny. The prosecution opened its case with emotional testimonies from Greg's victims. One by one, they stepped forward, their voices trembling but determined as they recounted their experiences. A middle-aged man described being pulled over for a minor infraction, only for Greg to escalate the situation into a humiliating search that left him feeling powerless. Another victim, a teenager, recounted being stopped on his way home from school, accused of carrying drugs he didn't have, and threatened with arrest if he didn't cooperate. Each testimony painted a damning picture of Greg's behavior, but it was Alicia Martinez's story that captured the courtroom's full attention. Alicia, a soft-spoken woman in her early 20s, walked to the witness stand with a quiet confidence. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her gaze was steady as she faced the room. Maria Hernandez approached her with a reassuring smile. Mrs. Martinez, can you tell the court what happened during your encounter with Sergeant Wilson? Alicia nodded, taking a deep breath. It was about 2 years ago, she began. I was walking home from work when he stopped me. He said I matched the description of someone who had stolen a purse earlier that day. Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. I told him I hadn't done anything wrong, but he wouldn't listen. He searched my bag right there on the sidewalk, in front of everyone. People were staring, judging me. I felt so small. Jason, sitting in the gallery beside his mother, felt a lump rise in his throat. Alicia's words mirrored his own experience so closely that it was almost unbearable to hear. When Maria finished questioning Alicia, Grant Holloway stood and adjusted his tie. He approached the stand with an air of calculated skepticism, his tone smooth but cutting. Ms. Martinez, he began. You say Sergeant Wilson searched your bag because you matched a description. Is that correct? Yes, Alicia replied. And how do you know you didn't match the description? Did you hear the police report yourself? Alicia frowned, her confidence wavering slightly. No, but So you're assuming Sergeant Wilson acted out of prejudice rather than genuine suspicion? Maria Hernandez immediately objected. The defense is badgering the witness. Withdrawn, Holloway said smoothly before turning back to Alicia. Tell me, Ms. Martinez, did Sergeant Wilson harm you physically during this encounter? No, Alicia admitted. Did he steal anything from you? No, she repeated, her voice quieter now. So what we're really talking about here, Holloway said, turning to the jury, is that you were embarrassed. Is that fair to say? Alicia's face flushed, and Jason gritted his teeth. He wanted to stand up and yell, to tell the court that humiliation was harm. But he stayed silent, his fists clenched in his lap. Maria quickly intervened, redirecting the questioning to allow Alicia to clarify her experience. Still, the damage was done. The defense's tactic of minimizing Greg's actions had left an impression. During a recess, Jason found himself pacing in a small waiting area outside the courtroom. Vanessa watched him from a bench nearby, her expression filled with quiet concern. She was so brave, Jason muttered, more to himself than to his mother. Vanessa nodded. She was. Jason turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and determination. I want to do that, he said suddenly. I want to tell them what happened to me. Vanessa stood, placing a hand on his arm. Are you sure? That's a lot of pressure, Jason. I'm sure, he said firmly. They need to know what it feels like. They need to hear it from me. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued to present its evidence. Emails, body cam footage, and internal memos that painted a damning picture of Greg's misconduct and the system that had enabled it. Greg, however, remained defiant. When he finally took the stand, his testimony was a mix of denial and deflection. I was just doing my job, he said, his voice firm. Sometimes you have to make tough calls out there. People don't understand what it's like to wear this badge. Maria Hernandez wasn't having it. Is that your excuse for harassing teenagers, intimidating civilians, and falsifying reports? She asked, her tone sharp. Greg's jaw tightened. I did what I had to do. And did you have to humiliate a young boy by ripping a chain off his neck in a crowded store? Maria pressed, her voice cutting through the courtroom. Greg hesitated, his composure faltering. That was a misunderstanding. Maria took a step closer. A misunderstanding or a clear abuse of power? On the third day of the trial, Jason took the stand. As he sat down, his palms felt clammy, but he reminded himself of Alicia's courage. Maria smiled at him reassuringly. Jason, can you tell the court what happened the night you encountered Sergeant Wilson? Jason nodded, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. He recounted the events of that night. The accusations, the way Greg had yanked the chain from his neck, and the humiliation that followed. I felt like I didn't matter, Jason said, his voice cracking slightly. Like I was nothing to him. Just a kid he could push around because he had a badge. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Grant Holloway didn't seem eager to cross-examine him. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats, their expressions somber. All eyes were on the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who held a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. Tension radiated through the room, an unspoken understanding that whatever came next would ripple far beyond the walls of this courthouse. Jason Carter sat in the front row with his parents, his heart pounding in his chest. Daniel's hand rested on Jason's shoulder, a steadying presence. Beside them, Vanessa clasped her hands tightly, whispering a silent prayer. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing. She unfolded the paper, glancing at it before speaking. "On the count of misconduct in public office, we find the defendant, Greg Wilson, guilty. On the count of excessive use of force, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of falsifying official reports, we find the defendant guilty." Each word hit like a wave, the weight of justice finally crashing down. A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by murmurs that grew louder as the verdict sank in. Jason exhaled sharply, the tension in his chest releasing all at once. He looked to his parents, seeing the same mix of relief and emotion in their faces. Daniel nodded at his son, his eyes glistening with pride. Across the room, Greg Wilson sat motionless, his face pale and his jaw clenched. His once confident demeanor had crumbled entirely. For a man who had spent years wielding power unchecked, the reality of accountability was a crushing blow. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. "Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date," he announced. "Court is adjourned." The moment the gavel struck, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of emotion. Victims embraced one another, tears streaming down their faces as they celebrated the long-awaited justice. Others sat quietly, reflecting on the weight of what had just transpired. Jason stayed seated for a moment, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. It wasn't just relief. It was validation, a confirmation that what he had endured mattered. Vanessa leaned over, wrapping her arms around him. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it." Daniel stood, shaking hands with Maria Hernandez and thanking her for her relentless work on the case. "This is a win," she said, her smile tempered by the knowledge of the larger fight ahead. As the crowd began to disperse, Jason noticed Greg being led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly, and something in Greg's gaze made Jason hesitate. "Wait," Jason said, turning to his father. Can I talk to him?" Daniel frowned, his protective instincts flaring. "Jason, I don't think—" "I need to," Jason insisted. After a brief pause, Daniel nodded. "I'll be right here," he said. Jason approached Greg cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. Greg's expression was unreadable as the officers escorting him paused, allowing Jason a moment. "Why did you do it?" Jason asked, his voice trembling but steady. Greg didn't answer right away. He looked at Jason, his eyes tired and hollow, before shrugging. "Because I could," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with the stark truth of their meaning. Jason swallowed hard, his emotions churning. "You didn't have to," he said. "You didn't have to treat me like I didn't matter." Greg's lips twitched, almost as if he wanted to say more, but he remained silent. The officers nudged him forward, leading him toward the exit. Jason watched him go, a strange mix of sadness and resolve settling over him. He turned back to his father, who placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What did he say?" Daniel asked. "Nothing that made sense," Jason replied, his voice soft but resolute. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric. Community members who had gathered to await the verdict erupted into cheers and applause when the news broke. People waved signs reading, "Justice for all" and "Accountability now." Amidst the celebration, others stood in quiet reflection, grappling with the broader implications of what had happened. The trial was a victory, but it was clear that the fight for systemic change was far from over. Jason and his family stepped out into the throng of supporters, greeted by handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. Jason felt the weight of their appreciation, but he also felt a new sense of responsibility. A man approached Daniel, his face lined with years of experience. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did here, it means everything. For all of us." Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "This is just the start. We've got a lot more work to do." That evening, the Carters gathered in their living room, the energy of the day slowly giving way to quiet reflection. Jason sat with his notebook open on his lap, jotting down his thoughts. I still can't believe it's over, Vanessa said, her tone a mix of relief and exhaustion. It's not over, Daniel replied. The trial was just one battle. The system that allowed Greg to get away with this for so long, it's still out there. Jason looked up from his notebook. But this was a step, right? A big one? Daniel smiled, pride evident in his expression. A big one, he agreed. And we'll keep taking steps until things change for good. Vanessa reached for Daniel's hand, squeezing it gently. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together, she said. Jason glanced at his notebook, then at his parents. I've been writing about everything, he said hesitantly. I think I want to share it. Maybe it can help someone. Daniel's smile widened. I think that's a great idea. The weeks following the trial brought a mix of relief and resolve for the Carter family. Greg Wilson's conviction had sent a powerful message, but Daniel knew the battle for systemic change was just beginning. Early mornings now found him at his desk or on calls with community leaders, activists, and policymakers. His office, still cluttered with case files and notes, had become a hub for strategizing reform efforts. One afternoon, Daniel met with a coalition of local and federal officials to discuss implementing new policies to prevent abuses of power like Greg's. The room was filled with a diverse group of stakeholders, law enforcement representatives, civil rights advocates, and community leaders. Transparency is the cornerstone of trust, Daniel said, addressing the room. Body camera footage shouldn't go missing. Complaints shouldn't be buried, and officers with repeated misconduct shouldn't stay on the force. These aren't radical ideas. They're common sense. A police union representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Agent Carter, we appreciate your input, but let's not forget that most officers serve honorably. These reforms could create a climate of fear for good cops. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. Good cops should welcome accountability. If we want the public to trust law enforcement, we have to show that the system holds everyone to the same standard, badge or no badge. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Daniel wasn't naive. He knew change wouldn't come easily. But the conviction in his voice left no doubt that he wouldn't stop fighting. While Daniel focused on systemic reform, Vanessa poured her energy into the community. She partnered with local organizations to create education programs aimed at empowering families, especially those from marginalized communities. One sunny Saturday, Vanessa hosted a workshop at a local community center. Parents and children filled the room, their voices buzzing with curiosity and anticipation. Vanessa stood at the front, her warm smile putting everyone at ease. Today, we're going to talk about how to advocate for yourselves and your families, she began. The world isn't always fair, but knowledge is power. And when we work together, we can create real change. Throughout the session, Vanessa shared practical advice, from understanding legal rights during encounters with law enforcement to building support networks. She encouraged parents to share their experiences, creating a space where their voices were heard and valued. Afterward, a mother approached her, holding her young son's hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've always felt like I was fighting alone, but now I feel like I have hope." Vanessa squeezed her hand, her heart swelling with purpose. "You're never alone," she said. "We're in this together." For Jason, the journey of healing took a different path. The trial and its aftermath had thrust him into the public eye, but it was his decision to share his story that truly marked a turning point. Invited to speak at a youth leadership conference, Jason stood backstage, clutching a small stack of index cards. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced. "You've got this," Vanessa whispered, giving him an encouraging pat on the back. When his name was called, Jason stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding him. He scanned the audience, a sea of young faces looking up at him with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, he began. "My name is Jason Carter," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "A few months ago, I had an experience that changed my life. It wasn't just about what happened to me. It was about realizing that my story could help others." He recounted his encounter with Greg Wilson, the trial, and the emotions he had struggled to process. "At first, I felt powerless," he admitted. "But I realized that speaking up is its own kind of power. And if my story can inspire even one person to stand up for what's right, then it's worth sharing. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. Jason stepped off the stage, his face glowing with a mix of relief and pride. "That was incredible," Vanessa said, pulling him into a hug. Jason smiled, his confidence growing. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his voice truly mattered. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Vanessa picked up the mail and found a plain envelope with no return address. Curious, she opened it and began reading silently. Her eyes welled up with tears. "What is it?" Jason asked, concerned. Vanessa cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "Dear Carters, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to say thank you. I was one of Greg Wilson's victims. For years, I carried the shame and anger of what he did to me, thinking no one would ever care. But then I saw what you did, how you stood up and refused to be silenced. Your fight gave me courage. Because of you, I feel like I can finally start to heal. Thank you for being brave." The room fell silent as the weight of the words sank in. Jason stared at his plate, his emotions swirling. "Whoever wrote this," Daniel said quietly, "they're proof that what we're doing matters." Jason nodded, his voice soft. "It's not just about us anymore, is it?" "No," Vanessa replied, reaching for his hand. "It never was." As the days turned into weeks, the Carters began to find a new rhythm. Life didn't return to normal. Normal was no longer an option, but it found a balance. Daniel continued his push for reform, attending meetings and drafting policy recommendations. Vanessa's workshops expanded, reaching more families and sparking a sense of empowerment in the community. Jason, now more confident in his voice, began speaking at schools and events, connecting with young people who saw themselves in his story. One afternoon, as the family sat together in the backyard, Jason looked around at his parents. "Do you think it'll ever get easier?" he asked. Daniel smiled, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not easier," he said, "but it'll get better, one step at a time." Vanessa nodded, adding, "And we'll keep taking those steps together." Jason leaned back, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The auditorium buzzed with the hum of conversation, a palpable energy radiating from the hundreds of young people gathered for the annual Youth Leadership Forum. Bright posters adorned the walls, each emblazoned with motivational slogans like, "Your voice matters," and "Be the change." At the front of the room, Jason Carter stood behind a simple wooden podium, his gold chain glinting under the stage lights. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the sea of faces before him. It was a surreal moment, a culmination of months of growth, reflection, and finding his voice. When the crowd settled, Jason leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and confident. "Good morning," he began, the room falling silent. "When I was younger, I thought strength was about keeping quiet, about trying not to stand out. But I've learned that real strength comes from speaking up, even when it's hard, even when you're scared." Jason paused, touching the gold chain around his neck. "This chain was a gift from my dad," he continued. "At first, it was just a reminder of who I was and where I came from. But over time, it became something more. It became a symbol of resilience, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless or invisible." He shared his story, recounting the night at the corner store, the trial, and the journey that followed. "I used to think my voice didn't matter," he said. "But what I've learned is that when you share your story, you can inspire others to find their own strength." The audience listened intently, many nodding along as Jason's words resonated deeply. Toward the end of his speech, Jason noticed a boy sitting near the front, slouched in his seat with his arms crossed. Something about the boy's expression, equal parts frustration and defeat, reminded Jason of himself not long ago. After the session, as attendees mingled and approached Jason to thank him, he sought out the boy. "Hey," Jason said, offering a friendly smile. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Devin," he muttered. "Nice to meet you, Devin. You seemed like you were thinking pretty hard during the forum," Jason said, his tone light but curious. Devin shrugged. "Yeah, well, I don't think talking about stuff really changes anything." Jason nodded, remembering his own doubts. "I used to think that too." he admitted. But sometimes, speaking up isn't just about changing the world. It's about changing yourself. Devin looked up, his guarded expression softening. Jason reached for the chain around his neck, unfastening it and holding it out. "Here," he said. Devin's eyes widened. "What?" "I can't take that. It's yours. It's ours now," Jason said with a grin. "This chain helped me remember who I am. Maybe it'll do the same for you." After a moment's hesitation, Devin took the chain, his fingers brushing the smooth gold surface. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. From the back of the room, Daniel watched the exchange, his heart swelling with pride. He had seen his son transform over the past months, growing from a boy consumed by fear and anger into a young man who could inspire others. Later, as they packed up to leave, Daniel found a quiet moment to reflect. Standing by the window, he looked out at the group of young people laughing and talking as they exited the building. Vanessa joined him, her hand resting on his arm. "You're thinking again?" she teased gently. Daniel smiled. "Just taking it all in," he said. "Everything we've been through. It wasn't easy, but seeing Jason up there today made it all worth it." Vanessa nodded. "He's stronger because of it. We all are." Daniel exhaled, a rare moment of peace washing over him. "For so long, I felt like I had to fix everything, like I had to carry the weight alone. But today, watching Jason, I realized something. This fight isn't mine anymore. It belongs to all of us." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "You've always been the one to lead, Daniel. But sometimes the best leaders know when to step back and let others carry the torch." The drive home was quiet, the hum of the car engine a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Jason sat in the back seat, scrolling through the photos and messages flooding his phone from attendees of the forum. "You okay back there?" Daniel asked, glancing at his son through the rearview mirror. Jason looked up, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." When they arrived home, Jason grabbed his notebook and went straight to his room. He opened it to a fresh page and began writing. "Today, I gave my chain to someone who needed it more than I did. It's funny. I thought I'd feel like I was losing something, but I didn't. It felt like I was gaining something instead. Maybe that's what strength really is. Not holding on, but letting go." In the weeks that followed, the Carters settled into a new normal. Daniel continued his work advocating for police reform, building alliances and pushing for policies that prioritized accountability and transparency. Vanessa's community programs expanded, offering hope and education to more families than ever. Jason, meanwhile, began planning his next forum, inspired by the impact of his first. The gold chain no longer hung around his neck, but its absence felt right, a symbol of his decision to share his strength with others. One evening, as the family sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jason turned to his parents. "Do you think things will really change?" he asked. Daniel's expression was thoughtful. "Change takes time," he said, "but every step we take brings us closer." Vanessa smiled. "And look how far we've already come." Jason nodded, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The Carter family's journey is a testament to the power of resilience and the courage to stand up for what's right. Their story reminds us that change often starts with one voice, one action, and one step toward justice. It's a story of pain, transformation, and ultimately, hope. A hope that inspires us to take a stand against injustice, no matter how daunting the fight may seem. But what about you? If faced with the challenges the Carters endured, would you find the courage to speak out? How would you take that first step toward making a difference in your community? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Together, let's keep the conversation going and work toward building a better, fairer world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.
The morning in Charlotte was a dreary one. A thick blanket of clouds stretching across the sky and a steady drizzle coating the city. Raindrops beaded on the windshield of Marcus Wright's black SUV as he eased it into a parking spot near the Memorial Parkside Clinic. It wasn't the best place to park, but at that moment, Marcus couldn't bring himself to care. His thoughts were elsewhere, on his daughter, Alicia. At just 14 years old, Alicia had faced more challenges than most adults. Diagnosed with lupus months earlier, she'd grown frailer with each passing week. That morning's checkup had brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Her doctor had assured him that the disease was stable, but the mounting side effects of her medication left Marcus feeling helpless. He'd built his life on control and discipline, but nothing in his military career, no war zone or command, had prepared him for watching his child suffer. He stepped out of the car, pulling his jacket tighter against the chill. His casual attire, a neatly pressed pair of dark jeans, a blue polo, and a lightweight coat, felt foreign compared to the uniform he'd worn for over 30 years. That uniform, which carried the weight of his rank in countless medals, was folded neatly in the trunk of the car. Today, though, he wasn't Colonel Marcus Wright, the highly decorated officer. He was just a father trying to be there for his child. On the other side of the street, Officer Travis Walker sat behind the wheel of a patrol car, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. At 28, Travis carried himself with the air of someone desperate to prove himself. He was tall and wiry, with sharp features and an expression that often flickered between smug confidence and barely veiled agitation. His reputation in the Charlotte Police Department was divisive. While some of his colleagues praised his eagerness and energy, others found his behavior impulsive and unnecessarily aggressive. Travis's partner for the day, Pete Andrews, sat in the passenger seat, flipping through a tablet with a bored expression. Pete was older, more experienced, and far less interested in the minutiae of their beat. He glanced up briefly as Marcus exited the SUV and shrugged. Regular parking zone. Probably just a guy running late, Pete muttered, returning to his tablet. But Travis's eyes lingered. The black SUV, polished to perfection, struck him as out of place, and something about the man stepping out of it rubbed him the wrong way. He watched as Marcus disappeared into the clinic, then drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. "I'm gonna check it out," Travis announced, opening his door. Pete sighed, barely looking up. "Walker, don't waste time on a damn parking violation. We've got bigger fish to fry." But Travis had already stepped into the drizzle, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his holstered firearm. He crossed the street with purpose, ignoring the rain soaking into his uniform. Minutes later, Marcus emerged from the clinic, his mind still consumed with thoughts of Alicia. The doctor had assured him there was no immediate cause for alarm, but the uncertainty of the future loomed heavy in Marcus's chest. He glanced at his SUV and quickened his pace. He needed to get back to her, back to the fragile girl who depended on him for strength he sometimes feared he no longer had. "Sir," the sharp voice cut through the rain, halting Marcus mid-step. He turned to see Travis approaching, his posture rigid, his expression hard. "Yes, officer?" Marcus replied, his voice calm but wary. "This your vehicle?" Travis asked, nodding toward the SUV. "It is," Marcus said, gesturing toward the car keys in his hand. "Is there a problem?" "It's parked in a regular zone. I need to see your identification, vehicle registration, and proof of permission to park here." Marcus frowned, confused by the unnecessarily hostile tone. "I understand, officer, but I was only inside for a few minutes. My daughter has a medical condition, and I needed to." "Did I ask for an explanation?" Travis snapped, cutting him off. "Just show me your ID." Marcus drew a slow breath, his years of training urging him to stay composed. He reached for the door handle of the SUV. "Let me grab my wallet. It's inside." But the moment Marcus opened the door, Travis's hand shot to his weapon. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice echoing across the street. The sudden escalation froze Marcus in place. He raised his hands, palms open, as pedestrians nearby began to turn their heads. A woman across the street pulled out her phone, her mouth agape. "Officer, "There's no need for this," Marcus said, keeping his tone steady. "I'm reaching for my wallet. Nothing more." "You don't make the rules here," Travis retorted, his hand tightening on his gun. "I said hands up. Don't move." Marcus obeyed, standing motionless in the rain as more onlookers gathered. "I'm Colonel Marcus Wright," he said firmly, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. "I've served this country for over 3 decades. I'm simply trying to—" "I don't care who you are," Travis interrupted, his voice rising. "You're a suspect in a suspicious vehicle, and I'm not taking any chances." The humiliation began to seep in, prickling at Marcus's skin. He had spent his entire life earning respect, fighting for a country that still, at times, saw him as less than. And now, here he was, standing in the rain with his hands raised like a common criminal, his rank and service meaningless in the face of Travis's prejudice. "Get on your knees," Travis ordered, his gun now fully drawn and pointed directly at Marcus. The murmurs from the growing crowd grew louder. A young man with a backpack yelled, "Hey, what are you doing?" "He's not resisting." Others began filming, their phones aimed at the unfolding scene. Marcus hesitated. "Officer, this isn't necessary," he said quietly. "On your knees," Travis repeated, his face reddening with frustration. Swallowing his pride, Marcus slowly lowered himself to the wet pavement, his knees pressing into the cold, damp concrete. His hands remained raised, trembling slightly from the chill. The rain plastered his clothes to his body, but the sting of humiliation burned hotter than any discomfort. The voices of the crowd grew louder, their disbelief palpable. "Are you serious right now?" one woman shouted. "He's an officer in the military." "Yeah, and this is how we treat our veterans," added another. But Travis's expression didn't waver. He kept his gun trained on Marcus, his jaw clenched in defiance. In that moment, Marcus felt the weight of every similar injustice he'd ever endured. Memories of being pulled over for driving while black, of being followed in stores, of being questioned in neighborhoods where he owned property. All of it came rushing back. For years, he had buried those moments, choosing to focus on his accomplishments rather than the barriers he'd faced. But now, on his knees in the rain, he realized how futile that had been. The hum of the crowd's voices was growing louder. The tension in the air had thickened to the point where it felt suffocating, even for those just passing by. Phones continued to capture every second of the encounter, their cameras trained on the sight of Marcus Wright, decorated military officer, a man who had given everything to his country, kneeling in the rain, hands raised, while a young, inexperienced cop held him at gunpoint. Marcus's breaths came slow and measured, but inside, a storm was raging. He'd faced high-stakes situations before. Deployments in hostile territories, moments when life or death hung on the split-second decisions he made as a leader. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his home, his country. And yet, here he was, kneeling like a criminal, stripped of his dignity in front of a growing sea of strangers. "Walker, what the hell are you doing?" The voice was sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Travis flinched, but he didn't lower his weapon. Turning his head slightly, he saw his sergeant, Elizabeth Carter, marching toward him from the second patrol car that had just pulled up to the scene. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s, her dark brown hair pulled back tightly into a bun. Her presence alone seemed to shift the dynamics of the scene. "Ma'am," Travis started, his voice defensive, "I've got the situation under control." "Under control?" Elizabeth barked, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene before her. "This is what you call control." She looked at Marcus, still kneeling on the wet pavement, his hands held high like he was in the middle of some war-zone surrender. Her eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained professional. "Sir," she said to Marcus, "please stand up." Travis spun toward her, his face a mixture of confusion and defiance. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I can't let him stand until I confirm he's not a threat. Elizabeth's gaze snapped back to Travis, her tone now icy. A threat? He's unarmed, kneeling in the rain and surrounded by witnesses. What part of that screams threat to you? Travis hesitated, his grip on his weapon tightening slightly. I don't trust him, he muttered. Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice low but firm. You don't trust him, or you don't trust the way he looks. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Travis's mouth opened, then closed again, his face flushing red. Put the weapon down, Elizabeth ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. For a moment, it looked like Travis might refuse. His jaw tightened, his fingers twitching on the grip of his firearm. But then, slowly, begrudgingly, he lowered his weapon and holstered it. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, though the tension was far from gone. Elizabeth turned back to Marcus. Colonel Wright, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. The words felt hollow, even as they left her mouth. How could this be called a misunderstanding when it was so clearly the result of bias? But Elizabeth knew she had to maintain composure, especially with all those phones recording her every move. Marcus stood slowly, brushing his wet hands on his jeans. He met Elizabeth's eyes, his expression calm but deeply tired. Sergeant, he said evenly, I'd like my wallet back now. Elizabeth nodded, motioning for Travis to retrieve it. Reluctantly, Travis pulled the wallet from where Marcus had dropped it during the commotion and handed it over. Marcus opened it, pulling out his military ID and holding it up for Elizabeth to see. Colonel Marcus Wright, Elizabeth said, reading the card aloud. Recognition flickered across her face. She'd heard his name before. Most people in law enforcement or the military had. He was a decorated officer, a man who had commanded respect for decades. She turned to Travis, her expression hard. Do you have any idea who this man is? Travis shifted uncomfortably. No, ma'am, but I don't see how that. It matters because you just pulled a gun on a national hero. Elizabeth snapped. Her voice echoed across the street, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Marcus raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. Sergeant Carter, if I may. Elizabeth turned to him, her jaw tightening. She nodded. I appreciate your apology, Marcus said, his tone measured. But this isn't just about who I am. It shouldn't take being a national hero for someone to be treated with basic dignity. I could have been anyone, someone without a title or a rank, and I still wouldn't have deserved this. The crowd murmured in agreement. Elizabeth nodded, her expression softening slightly. You're right, she said quietly. You're absolutely right. But Travis couldn't let it go. With all due respect, ma'am, he interrupted, I was just doing my job. I followed procedure. How was I supposed to know he wasn't a threat? Marcus turned to Travis then, his eyes locking onto the young officers with a quiet intensity. You didn't see a man, Marcus said, his voice steady but piercing. You saw a black man in a nice car, and you made a decision before I even opened my mouth. That's not procedure. That's prejudice. Travis's face turned a deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth to argue, but Elizabeth cut him off. Enough, Walker, she said sharply. You've done enough. By now. The rain had started to ease, though the street was still slick and glistening. The crowd began to disperse, some people shouting words of support toward Marcus, others glaring at Travis as they walked away. But many lingered, still filming, still watching. Elizabeth pulled Travis aside, her voice low but firm. You're done for today. Hand me your badge and your weapon. What? Travis's eyes widened. Sergeant, you can't? I can, and I just did. Elizabeth interrupted. You're officially on administrative leave, effective immediately. We'll be reviewing this incident, and I can tell you right now, it doesn't look good for you. Travis stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He reluctantly unholstered his weapon and unclipped his badge, handing them over with trembling hands. As Elizabeth turned back to Marcus, she felt the weight of what had just happened. She wasn't just dealing with an officer who'd made a mistake. She was dealing with a system that had failed, again and again, to root out these mistakes before they happened. "Colonel Wright," she said quietly, "if there's anything I can do to make this right." Marcus shook his head, a faint, humorless smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You can't undo what's already been done, Sergeant. But you can start by holding your people accountable." With that, he turned and walked back to his SUV, his shoulders straight despite the weight he carried. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. Behind him, the crowd was finally beginning to disperse. The video footage they had captured would soon spread across social media like wildfire, sparking outrage and conversations that would stretch far beyond the borders of Charlotte. But for Marcus, the fight wasn't over. It never really had been. The video had gone viral within hours. By the time Marcus Wright returned home that evening, his face, his name, and the humiliating footage of him kneeling in the rain had become the top story on every major news outlet. Social media was ablaze with outrage, hashtags demanding justice, and heated debates about systemic racism in law enforcement. Marcus had tried to ignore the endless stream of notifications on his phone, but it was impossible to escape the reality of what had unfolded. His daughter, Alicia, had seen it. His ex-wife, Angela, had seen it. His colleagues in the military had seen it. And so, Marcus sat in the quiet of his living room, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a crushing tide. The walls around him were lined with photos, snapshots of his decorated career in the military, medals gleaming on his chest, handshakes with generals and presidents. They seemed almost mocking now, as if to remind him that none of it had mattered in the eyes of one young cop. The sound of his daughter's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Dad?" He looked up to see Alicia standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the soft glow of the hallway light. She was wearing one of his old Army t-shirts, the fabric oversized on her slender body. Her face was pale, her dark curls tied back loosely. "Yes, sweetheart," Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone light. She stepped closer, holding up her phone. The video was paused on the screen, frozen on the image of Marcus kneeling with his hands raised. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she looked at him. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked softly. Marcus's chest tightened. He took a deep breath, motioning for her to sit beside him. She hesitated before curling up next to him on the couch, her head resting against his shoulder. "Because Alicia," he began slowly, "sometimes fighting back isn't about what you do in the moment. Sometimes it's about how you handle what comes after. But he humiliated you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You didn't do anything wrong, and he treated you like you were nothing." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, the memory of Travis Walker's voice, sharp, accusatory, dripping with disdain, echoing in his mind. "I know," he said quietly, "and it hurt. But if I had fought back, if I had raised my voice or made a sudden move, do you know what could have happened?" Alicia didn't respond, but the tears slipping down her cheeks spoke volumes. "Sweetheart, I've been fighting battles like this my whole life," Marcus continued. "Not just in war zones, but here, at home. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stay calm when the world is trying to break you. But staying calm doesn't mean I'm not fighting. It just means I'm choosing a different way to win." Alicia sniffled, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. "Is that why you didn't say anything about what happened before?" "Mom told me. About that time years ago when you got pulled over." Marcus froze. He hadn't realized Angela had told Alicia about that incident. It had been one of the most painful moments of his life. Being stopped by a cop Ford driving while black, accused of stealing his own car because it was too nice for someone like him. He'd been furious, humiliated, but Angela had convinced him not to file a formal complaint. "You had just gotten that promotion," Angela had said at the time. "If you make waves now, it could ruin everything we've worked for." And so, Marcus had swallowed his pride and let it go. But now, sitting beside his daughter, he realized how much he regretted that decision. I didn't speak up then because I was afraid, Marcus admitted. Afraid of what it would do to my career, to our family. But that was a mistake. Staying silent didn't protect me. It just let the problem keep growing. Alicia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. So, what are you going to do now? Marcus hesitated. He hadn't let himself think about the next steps. He'd been so consumed by the humiliation, the anger, the disbelief, that he hadn't considered what his response should be. But as he looked at his daughter, her face full of hope and pain, he knew he couldn't stay silent this time. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I promise you, I'm going to do something. The next morning, Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from journalists, colleagues, and even strangers poured in nonstop. He ignored most of them, but one name on the screen caught his attention: General Harold Bennett. Harold had been Marcus's mentor for years, a man he deeply respected. Answering the call, Marcus was greeted by Harold's gruff, familiar voice. "Marcus," Harold said, "I saw the video." Marcus sighed. "Yeah, I figured you would." "Listen," Harold continued, "what happened to you is unacceptable. But I know you, Marcus. You're not the kind of man who lets this slide. So tell me, what are you planning to do?" Marcus hesitated, the weight of the question settling on him. "I don't know, Harold. Part of me just wants to move on, for Alicia's sake. But another part of me knows that if I don't speak up now, it's only going to keep happening. To me, to others like me." "Then you have your answer," Harold said firmly. "You've spent your whole career fighting for this country. Now it's time to fight for something just as important: justice. If you need support, you know I've got your back." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Harold. That means a lot." After the call ended, Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window at the gray sky. He thought about the countless men and women who had faced the same kind of humiliation he had, some of whom hadn't lived to tell their stories. It wasn't just about him anymore. Later that day, Marcus's doorbell rang. Standing on his porch was Sergeant Elizabeth Carter, looking tense and uncomfortable. She held a folder in one hand and a nervous expression on her face. "Colonel Wright," she began, "I wanted to stop by and personally apologize again for what happened yesterday." Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to come inside. She hesitated before stepping into the living room, her eyes scanning the walls lined with his military achievements. "I also wanted to give you this," Elizabeth said, handing him the folder. Marcus opened it to find a formal report on the incident, along with an internal memo stating that Officer Travis Walker had been placed on indefinite suspension, pending further investigation. "I know it's not enough," Elizabeth said quietly, "but I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Marcus studied her for a moment, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, "but you're right, it's not enough. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows people like him to think this kind of behavior is acceptable." Elizabeth nodded, her expression grim. "I agree, and I want to help, if you'll let me." Marcus considered her words, a spark of determination igniting within him. "All right," he said, "let's start with accountability. But this fight isn't going to end there." Elizabeth nodded, her jaw set with resolve. "I'm with you, sir." The stage was set. Marcus knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity. It was about changing the system that had tried to strip it away in the first place. The fight was far from over. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of chaos, anger, and determination. The video of Marcus Wright's humiliating treatment at the hands of Officer Travis Walker had grown beyond viral. It had become a rallying cry. Across the country, protests began to swell, first in Charlotte, then in cities as far away as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The footage was shown on every news channel, accompanied by heated debates about police misconduct, racial bias, and the need for reform. For Marcus, however, the attention was both a blessing and a burden. He hadn't asked to be thrust into the spotlight. His goal had never been to become a symbol of resistance, but the circumstances left him no choice. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some thanked him for his strength and resilience, while others looked at him with pity, as if they couldn't separate the man from the moment of humiliation they had all seen. Marcus spent most of those days holed up in his home, fielding calls from activists, reporters, and even politicians. The weight of it all threatened to crush him, but it was Alicia who kept him grounded. She watched everything unfold with wide eyes and a mix of awe and fear, seeing her father transform from the quiet, disciplined man she had always known into a reluctant but powerful voice for change. On the third day, Marcus received a call that shifted the momentum entirely. Colonel Wright, the voice on the other end of the line, said, firm and deliberate, "This is Senator Caroline Hunter. I've been following your story, and I'd like to meet with you." Marcus hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. Senator Hunter was a well-known advocate for police reform, a figure who had spent years fighting for legislation to address systemic racism in law enforcement. If she wanted to meet, it meant his story had struck a chord far beyond social media outrage. "I'm listening," Marcus said. The meeting took place the next morning in a private conference room at a downtown hotel. Marcus arrived dressed sharply in a dark suit, his military bearing intact despite the emotional toll of the past week. Senator Hunter, a petite but commanding woman in her late 50s, greeted him warmly, her piercing blue eyes studying him as they shook hands. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Colonel," she said, motioning for him to sit. "Thank you for reaching out," Marcus replied. "But I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure why I'm here." Hunter leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "Because your story is more than just a viral video, Colonel. It's a spotlight on a system that's been broken for far too long. And because I believe you have the power to help change it." Marcus tilted his head, his expression skeptical. "I'm a soldier, Senator. I'm not a politician or an activist." "No," Hunter agreed. "But you're a man with a voice people are listening to. And right now, that voice could make a real difference." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. He'd spent years avoiding situations like this, focusing on his duties and his family rather than engaging in public battles over race and justice. But the memory of kneeling in the rain, of Travis Walker's gun trained on him while the world watched, burned in his mind. He couldn't ignore it anymore. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked finally. Hunter's eyes lit up with determination. "We're drafting a new police reform bill. It's ambitious, but it has teeth. Mandatory bias training, independent oversight boards, stricter protocols for use of force. What I need is someone like you, someone with a story and a presence, to testify in front of Congress when the time comes, to show them the human cost of inaction." The thought of standing before Congress, of bearing his soul in such a public and vulnerable way, made Marcus's stomach churn. But as he pictured Alicia's face, her question echoing in his mind, "Why didn't you fight back?" he realized he already knew his answer. "When do you need me?" he asked. Meanwhile, Travis Walker's world was falling apart. The suspension had been swift and public, leaving him with no time to prepare for the fallout. His name and face had been splashed across every news network, branded as the poster child for everything wrong with modern policing. At first, Travis tried to convince himself that he was the victim in all of this. He told anyone who would listen that he'd only been doing his job, that he'd followed protocol, that Marcus Wright's fame and rank had unfairly turned the public against him. But the more he watched the footage, reluctantly, as it played on loop on every screen he passed, the more he saw the truth staring back at him. He saw the fear and humiliation in Marcus's eyes. He saw the crowd's growing horror as he barked orders and waved his gun. And, most disturbingly, he saw the look on his own face, the arrogance, the anger, the judgment. The department's internal investigation was ongoing, but Travis already knew how it would end. His career in law enforcement was over. He'd been made an example of, and no amount of excuses could change that. But what haunted Travis the most wasn't the loss of his job or his reputation. It was the nagging realization that Marcus had been right. He hadn't seen a man that day. He'd seen a stereotype, an assumption, a threat that didn't exist. And now, the weight of that mistake was threatening to crush him. On the day of the first protest in Charlotte, Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets as he took in the sight before him. Hundreds of people had gathered, their signs raised high, their voices ringing out with chants demanding justice and reform. Alicia stood beside him, holding a sign she'd made herself. "Treat us with dignity." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched her. She was too young to be fighting this fight, too young to understand the depths of the hatred and ignorance they were up against. But she stood tall, her eyes fierce and determined, and Marcus felt a flicker of pride. As the crowd swelled, a young organizer approached Marcus. She was in her 20s, with a megaphone slung over her shoulder and a determined expression on her face. "Colonel Wright?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "Yes, we'd like you to speak," she said. "People need to hear from you." Marcus hesitated, the weight of the request pressing down on him. He wasn't a public speaker. He was a soldier, a father. But as he looked out at the crowd, he realized that his story wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to everyone who had ever been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. Taking the megaphone from the organizer, Marcus stepped onto the makeshift stage. The crowd quieted as he raised the device to his lips, their eyes fixed on him. "My name is Marcus Wright," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "I've spent my life serving this country, fighting for the freedoms we all hold dear. But last week, I was reminded that some of us are still fighting for the most basic freedom of all, the freedom to be treated with dignity." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy washing over him like a wave. Marcus took a deep breath, the weight in his chest lifting slightly as he continued. "This isn't just my fight," he said. "It's our fight, and it's a fight we have to win, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come after us. Because no one should have to kneel in the rain with a gun pointed at their head to prove their humanity." The cheers grew louder, the crowd chanting his name as Marcus stepped back from the microphone. For the first time since the incident, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of hope. But he knew the fight was far from over. The day had finally come. Marcus Wright sat quietly in the waiting area outside the congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. The air was heavy with anticipation, the hall bustling with aides, journalists, and politicians moving purposefully to their places. Alicia sat beside him, her hand resting on his, a reassuring presence despite her young age. "Are you nervous?" she asked softly, looking up at her father. Marcus gave her a small smile, though the tightness in his chest betrayed his calm demeanor. "A little," he admitted, "but this isn't about me, Alicia. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. After Marcus's speech at the protest in Charlotte, the momentum behind the movement had grown exponentially. His name became synonymous with calls for accountability and reform, and Senator Caroline Hunter's police reform bill had gained national attention, with Marcus positioned as its most prominent advocate. But none of it had been easy. Marcus had spent countless sleepless nights replaying the incident in his mind, questioning whether he was the right person for this fight. He wasn't a politician or an activist. He was just a man who had endured one humiliation too many. But as Alicia often reminded him, sometimes the people who don't seek the spotlight are the ones most deserving of it. A clerk appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Colonel Wright, they're ready for you." Marcus stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket. He glanced down at Alicia, who gave him an encouraging nod, and then made his way into the hearing room. The room was packed. Rows of reporters filled the back, their cameras trained on him as he took his seat at the witness table. On the raised dais sat the members of Congress, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and, in some cases, indifference. Senator Hunter sat near the center, giving Marcus a small nod of encouragement. "Colonel Marcus Wright," the chairman said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You may begin." Marcus adjusted the microphone in front of him, his hands steady despite the pressure of the moment. He took a deep breath and began. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Marcus Wright. I'm a father, a soldier, and a proud American. I've dedicated over 30 years of my life to serving this country, defending the freedoms we all hold dear. But a few weeks ago, I was reminded that for some of us, those freedoms are still conditional." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. On a rainy morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, I was stopped by a police officer while leaving a medical clinic. I was unarmed, compliant, and calm, but that didn't matter. To that officer, I wasn't a man, I was a threat. He drew his gun on me, forced me to kneel in the rain, and humiliated me in front of a crowd of strangers. And why? Because of the color of my skin and the assumptions he made because of it. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "I'm not here today because I want revenge. I'm here because I want change. I want a future where no one, black, white, or otherwise, has to fear the people who are supposed to protect them. I want a future where my daughter doesn't have to ask me why I didn't fight back, because she knows that dignity and justice aren't things you have to fight for. They're things you're born with." Senator Hunter leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Colonel Wright, in your experience, do you believe incidents like yours are isolated events, or do they represent a broader issue within law enforcement?" Marcus looked directly at her, his voice firm. "They're not isolated, Senator. They're part of a pattern that's been ignored for far too long. I'm not saying every officer is like the one who humiliated me, but the system allows people like him to thrive. It rewards aggression over empathy, bias over fairness. And until that changes, the system will keep failing us." The hearing continued for hours, with Marcus fielding questions from both supportive and skeptical members of the committee. He spoke about his own experience, about the countless others who hadn't been lucky enough to walk away from similar encounters, and about the need for meaningful reform. By the time it was over, the room was buzzing with a sense of urgency that hadn't been there before. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of Marcus's testimony were felt across the country. Senator Hunter's reform bill, now known as the Wright Act, gained bipartisan support and passed through Congress with surprising speed. The legislation mandated comprehensive bias training for all law enforcement officers, established independent oversight boards in every state, and implemented stricter protocols for use of force incidents. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the legislative halls. It was in the quiet moments with Alicia, knowing that he had kept his promise to her. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home, Alicia turned to him with a smile. "You did it, Dad," she said softly. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't do it alone, and it's not over yet. There's still a lot of work to be done." "I know," Alicia said, her voice full of conviction, "but you started it, and that's what matters." As for Travis Walker, his career in law enforcement was officially over. The department's investigation had found him guilty of gross misconduct, and he was terminated with no possibility of reinstatement. The public backlash had been harsh, but in the end, it was a quiet introspection that changed him the most. Months after the incident, Travis reached out to Marcus through an attorney, requesting a private meeting. At first, Marcus was reluctant, unsure of what good could come from facing the man who had humiliated him. But Alicia, ever the voice of reason, encouraged him to go. When they met in a small, nondescript conference room, Travis looked like a shadow of the arrogant officer Marcus remembered. He was thinner, his eyes hollow, his demeanor subdued. "Colonel Wright," Travis began, his voice trembling slightly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything, for the way I treated you, for the assumptions I made. I was wrong." Marcus studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of insincerity. But all he saw was a broken man, one who had been forced to confront his own biases in the harshest way possible. "I appreciate your apology," Marcus said finally, "but this isn't about me forgiving you. It's about you making sure this never happens again. To anyone." Travis nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I will. I swear I will." Months turned into years, and the world continued to change. The Wright Act became a cornerstone of police reform across the nation, and Marcus Wright's name became synonymous with resilience and the fight for justice. But for Marcus, the real legacy wasn't in the laws or the headlines. It was in the quiet strength he'd found in himself, in the pride he saw in his daughter's eyes, and in the knowledge that he had turned a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for hope. Because in the end, dignity wasn't something anyone could take from him. It was something he carried within, no matter the storm.